Do you feel like you're waiting for a sign from God? But deep down something inside you already knows what. How many times have you asked for confirmation and still remained stuck? What if the problem isn't a lack of answers, but the difficulty of accepting the answer that has already been given? In this video, you'll understand why this feeling of waiting is often, in reality, a way of avoiding a decision that requires courage. We're going to uncover the signs you may have already ignored, the reason you remain stuck, even while seeking direction, and how to distinguish real doubt from internal resistance. Because there's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to face what has already become clear. If you watch until the end, you'll gain something rare: clarity. Clarity to break out of paralysis, to make decisions with greater confidence, and to recognize where God has already spoken, even without repeating himself. So let me ask you, are you truly waiting for a sign? Or are you waiting to feel safe before you obey? Before we continue, something important. This video was created with the help of artificial intelligence tools, not to replace truth, but to bring clarity to what you may already be feeling, yet haven't been able to put into words. Now, let's step into the point that may explain exactly why you feel this way. There is a kind of waiting that doesn't bring peace. It just keeps you suspended. You keep thinking about the same decision, revisiting the same scenarios, imagining different possibilities, but you never reach a point of action. And on the outside, this looks like wisdom. It looks like someone who is trying to find the right direction, but on the inside, there is a silent exhaustion that doesn't make sense. Because if it were truly a lack of direction, you wouldn't keep returning to the same point. Pay close attention to this. When a person genuinely doesn't know what to do, they explore different paths. But when they repeatedly return to the same doubt, it's usually not the absence of an answer. It's the difficulty of accepting a specific answer. And that completely changes how you interpret this moment. You may be telling yourself that you're waiting on God, when in reality, you're trying to feel ready for something that has already become clear. You ask for another sign, another confirmation, another sense of peace, as if that would validate the decision. But deep down the direction doesn't change, only your level of comfort with it does. And that comfort never fully comes. There is a very common and dangerous idea that when God speaks, everything aligns perfectly inside you, as if certainty comes with complete calm, no fear, total security. But that is not the pattern of faith. In reality, many of the most important decisions come with tension. In 2 Timothy 1-7 it says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind." And this verse is not about the absence of fear. It's about the ability to act despite it. The problem is that you may be interpreting discomfort as a sign that it's not the right time, when in fact, it may be the exact sign that it is. Because decisions that require growth are rarely comfortable. So without realizing it, you begin to create a cycle. You pray, receive internal direction. But since it requires movement, you go back to praying, hoping the next answer will be different, easier, more aligned with what you want. But it doesn't change, and that starts to generate frustration. Not because God hasn't answered, but because the answer wasn't the one you expected. Over time, this dynamic becomes even more subtle. You begin to believe that you're being patient, when in reality, you're prolonging a process that could have already moved forward. And that creates a constant feeling of being stuck in life. Nothing seems to evolve. The same questions keep returning. The same unrest remains. And even while seeking God, you don't feel progress. But maybe the problem isn't in the seeking. It's in the lack of movement after the answer, because direction without action does not produce transformation. And this is where an important tension begins to emerge. Maybe this phase isn't about waiting more, but about recognizing what has already been shown and deciding what to do with it. But before any decision, you need to see the pattern that is keeping you in this place. There is a very subtle point, where waiting stops being wisdom and starts becoming avoidance. And the most dangerous part is that it doesn't feel wrong. You keep praying, keep seeking direction, keep trying to do everything right, but in practice, nothing changes. The decision keeps being postponed, the action keeps being delayed, and little by little, what seemed like a healthy spiritual process begins to turn into a cycle of paralysis, because avoidance doesn't present itself as avoidance. It presents itself as caution. You tell yourself it's not the right time yet, that you need more clarity, that maybe God will confirm it in another way, and all of this sounds reasonable, until you realize you've been saying the same things for weeks, months, maybe even years, and that reveals something important. The problem is not how long you've been waiting. It's that your waiting is not producing progress. In Ecclesiastes 11:4 it says, "He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap." And this verse describes exactly this pattern. The person who always finds a reason not to act. There's always a variable that isn't perfect yet. There's always a detail that isn't clear enough. There's always a reasonable justification to delay just a little longer. But the effect of this is cumulative, because the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to act. A decision that once seemed possible starts to feel risky. A step that once felt simple starts to feel too big. And without realizing it, you strengthen a comfort zone that doesn't to protect you, it just keeps you in the same place. And this comfort zone is silent. It doesn't shout. It doesn't confront you. It doesn't force you to change. On the contrary, it gives you convincing arguments to stay exactly where you are. And that's why so many people stay stuck in it for so long, because it doesn't feel like a prison. It feels like wisdom. But there is a clear difference between wisdom and spiritual procrastination. Wisdom evaluates and then decides. Spiritual procrastination evaluates and keeps evaluating indefinitely. And this constant repetition of analysis creates internal exhaustion. You begin to feel tired without having done anything, mentally overloaded, emotionally confused, spiritually stuck, because there is energy being spent every day, but not on action, and instead on indecision. And this creates a dangerous illusion, the feeling that you are doing something, when in reality, you are just spinning in the same place. There is also another factor that almost no one notices. The more you delay a decision, the more attached you become to your current state, even if it no longer makes sense, even if it's already uncomfortable, because human beings tend to adapt to what is familiar, even when it's not what's best. Under overthinking, leaving that place starts to feel harder than staying in it, not because it truly is, but because you've been there too long, and that is the invisible risk of waiting longer than necessary. It's not just about losing time, it's about losing sensitivity, because little by little, you get used to indecision. You begin to accept stagnation as something normal, and what once bothered you becomes something you tolerate until the point where you no longer feel urgency to change. And when that happens, it's no longer a matter of lack of direction, it becomes a matter of settling. But something even deeper is happening here, because this continuous waiting is not neutral. It is shaping you. It is reinforcing mental, emotional, and spiritual patterns that pull you away from movement. It is teaching you, without you realizing it, not to act, even when you already know what needs to be done. And this pattern, if it's not broken, will begin to repeat itself in other areas of your life. But to break this cycle, you first need to see something that may already be right in front of you, and you still haven't noticed it. There is something you may not want to admit, but it keeps coming back. No matter how much you try to ignore, distract, or rationalize it, that direction remains. It doesn't fade, weaken, or disappear. It stays there, quiet, consistent, waiting to be recognized. And that is not a coincidence, because often, the sign you're waiting for is already happening, just not the way you expected. You may have expected something clearer, more supernatural, undeniable, a confirmation that removes all doubt and discomfort. But most of the time, God doesn't work that way. He speaks simply, directly, repeatedly. In John 10:27 it says, "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me." It doesn't say they wait for extraordinary signs. It says they recognize the voice, and recognizing is not certainty, it's perceiving a direction, even without comfort. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you. There is a conviction you felt more than once, something that returns in silence, in prayer, when distractions fade, and that you try to soften or reinterpret, because accepting it would require change, letting go, leaving what is familiar, even if it no longer fits. And that's why you keep waiting, not because there is no sign, but because it doesn't match what you wanted. You also start to notice repetition, similar conversations, situations pointing the same way, the same inner restlessness, all forming a pattern. But instead of recognizing it, you look for something different, stronger, clearer, more definitive, as if God needed to increase the signal for you to respond. But the pattern is the answer, and the more you ignore it, the clearer it becomes. Because God doesn't adjust direction to match resistance. He keeps it until you're willing to obey. And that creates a strange tension. But you don't act. You see, but you don't move. And that is exhausting. Because you're not lost. You're divided. One part of you recognizes the path. Another part is still negotiating, trying to find something easier, safer, more predictable. But that alternative never appears, because the goal is not a new direction. It's accepting the one already given, and this needs to be clear. God's signal doesn't always bring relief. Often, it brings confrontation, because it reveals what must change, be left, or be faced. And that creates resistance, not because it's wrong, but because it requires growth. So you begin to doubt, not the direction, but your ability to follow it. And that's when many ask for another sign, as if that would solve the real issue. But it doesn't, because the problem isn't confirmation. It's decision, and until that is faced, you remain in the cycle, knowing, but not moving. And maybe now, something is becoming clearer. Maybe a specific situation came to your mind. A decision you've been avoiding. Something you already know, but haven't fully faced. If that happened, it wasn't by accident. Now let me make you a simple invitation. If this kind of content is helping you see more clearly what you were already feeling, take this moment and subscribe to the channel. Because the goal here is not just to motivate. It's to bring understanding that truly transforms the way you live. And this is just the beginning. Because recognizing the sign is one thing, but understanding why you still haven't responded to it is where everything truly begins to change. There is a deeper, more honest explanation for all of this. And it's not a lack of direction. It's within you, when the answer has already been given and you still don't act. It shows the blockage isn't external. It's not that God didn't speak. It's not the circumstances. There is something inside you resisting what is already clear. And this resistance is rarely obvious. It doesn't look like rebellion. It doesn't feel like disobedience. Instead, it hides behind rational thoughts, reasonable arguments, ideas that seem right on the surface. But underneath, there is fear. Fear of losing, fear of failing, fear of leaving something that still feels safe. And this fear is not weak. It is subtle, because it disguises itself as wisdom. You begin to think you're being careful, responsible, when in reality, you're trying to control something that requires surrender. And while you try to control every outcome, you stop the one thing that would move everything forward: action. In John 8:32 it says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But there's something often overlooked. The truth sets you free, but first, it confronts you. It exposes what you don't want to see. It shows that your struggle is not a lack of clarity, but the difficulty of accepting what that clarity requires. And that creates discomfort, because accepting the truth means taking responsibility. It means recognizing that you already know what to do, and that staying stuck is no longer doubt, it's a choice. And that changes everything, because from that moment, you can no longer hide behind the idea of waiting on God. You begin to see that you are waiting for something inside you to change, before you obey. But that change doesn't come before the decision. It comes after. Another strong factor here is attachment. You may be holding on to something that no longer makes sense, but still has emotional weight. A situation, a relationship, a phase. Something you know you need to leave, but aren't ready to release. And that creates tension. One part of you understands. The other still wants to hold on. And while that conflict remains, you stay stuck. There is also the need to guarantee everything will work out before acting. You want certainty. You want to avoid regret. You want predictability in something that requires faith. But that's not possible, Faith is not acting with guarantees. It is acting with trust, without full control. And replacing faith with control will always keep you stuck. Another key point is confusing peace with the absence of risk. Many believe the right decision will feel calm and secure. But in reality, many right decisions come with tension, doubt, even fear. Not because they're wrong, but because they require growth. So Unipris tempista back, and the cycle repeats. But there is a question that needs honesty. If you already know what to do, what is stopping you? It's not information. It's not direction. It's not a lack of signs. It's something deeper. And when you see that clearly, waiting loses its meaning. Because you're not waiting for something external. You're avoiding an internal decision. And that realization, as uncomfortable as it is the beginning of freedom. But understanding this is not enough. Because there is a silent consequence in continuing to delay. That most people only notice too late. There is a silent consequence in continuing to delay. One that is almost never noticed at the beginning. Because at first, it feels harmless. You just decide to wait a little longer. You postpone one more time. You give it a bit more time to see if something changes. And in isolation, that doesn't seem like a problem. But the real effect is not in a single decision. It's in the pattern that forms from it. Because every time you delay, you reinforce the idea that you don't need to act right now. And that begins to accumulate. Life continues happening around you. Opportunities keep appearing. Cycles keep moving forward. But you remain in the same place. Not because you can't move, but because you haven't decided. And over Chimi this starts to create kind of where that isn't immediate. But you feel stuck. You feel like something inside you isn't evolving. You feel like you could be somewhere else. But you don't quite know why you haven't gotten there. And that feeling doesn't come from a lack of ability. It comes from a lack of movement. In Ecclesiastes 11:2, for it says, "He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap." This is not just about inaction, but its consequences over time. If you don't sow, you don't reap. It's that simple. This is not punishment. It's a natural result. When you delay important decisions, you're not just buying time. You're giving up what would come from that decision. Paths not taken, experiences not lived, growth that never happens. And the hardest part is that you don't see it right away. That's why it's easy to keep delaying. Another silent effect is the loss of sensitivity. At first, direction is clear, conviction is strong, discomfort is obvious. But as you keep ignoring it, something changes. You get used to it. That restlessness becomes tolerable. That urgency starts to fade, not because it disappeared, but because you stopped responding, and that weakens your spiritual perception. Not because God stopped speaking, but because you started listening less. And this is critical. The more you ignore, the less sensitive you become, and the less sensitive you become, the harder it is to recognize when God speaks again. Another point is the increasing weight of the decision. What once felt simple now feels bigger, riskier, harder, not because it changed, but because time passed. And time, when used to avoid, complicates everything. It adds fear, variables, and possibilities, and this feeds indecision, creating a cycle. The more you delay, the harder it feels to act, and the harder it feels to act, the more you delay, until you start believing you can't. But that's not true. You are not incapable. You are conditioned not to act, and that must be broken. Because the greatest risk is not making a wrong decision. It's staying where you are. A decision can be adjusted. It can be corrected. It can teach you. But no decision changes nothing. And staying where you are, when you know you need to move, is one of the quietest ways to lose time in life. But maybe something inside you is reacting right now. Maybe there's discomfort. Maybe a specific memory came to your mind. And that's not negative. That's awareness. Because recognizing the impact of waiting creates the urgency to change. And that urgency doesn't come from pressure. It comes from clarity. Now you begin to see waiting is not neutral. It's affecting you, shaping you, keeping you from something that could have already begun, but there is a way out. And it doesn't require more analysis. It requires a change in posture. Underscored, there is a silent expectation that keeps many people stuck. The belief that you need complete clarity before you act. As if you could see the whole path, understand every outcome, eliminate every risk, and only then decide it sounds wise. But it doesn't work that way, because folkmen is an illusion, and as long as you wait for it, you stay stuck. God doesn't reveal the entire path at once. He reveals the next step, and that requires more than understanding. It requires trust. In Hebrews 11:8 it says, "By faith, Abraham went, not knowing where he was going. He didn't move because he had all the answers. He moved because he had enough direction for the first step, and that changes everything. You don't need to know everything. You need to know enough to begin. But in practice, you try to reverse this. You want to feel safe first, then act, and because of that, you never act. That says doesn't come before it comes her. It comes in movement, in experience, in obedience, and that requires a different kind of mindset. A mindset that understands that small decisions unlock bigger directions, that a simple step, even without absolute certainty, can open paths that were completely invisible before, because movement creates vision. While you are standing still, everything feels uncertain, but when you begin to act, things start to align. You understand better. You notice details you couldn't see before. You gain confirmation through the journey itself. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because clarity is on the other side of the decision. Another important point is that you don't need to make a perfect decision. You need to make an honest one, aligned with what you already understand right now, without trying to predict every outcome, without trying to guarantee that you won't make mistakes. Because growth doesn't come from perfection. It comes from the willingness to move forward. And many times, what you call waiting a little longer is actually avoiding this process of growth, because it involves uncertainty, it involves exposure, it involves leaving a place where you still have control, and stepping into a place where you need to trust. But it is exactly in that space that transformation happens. And maybe what you most need to understand right now is that you are not being called to have everything figured out. You are being called to take the next step. Nothing more than that. Not the entire path, not the full plan, just the next step. And that makes everything simpler and more challenging at the same time. Simpler because it removes complexity. More challenging because it removes excuses. If you already know the next step, then the issue is no longer clarity. It's choosing to act. And that choice doesn't depend on feeling completely safe. It depends on deciding to trust. Maybe not with all the answers, but with enough direction. From that moment on, something begins to shift. You stop living in waiting and start moving forward. And that changes the way you relate to God, to your decisions, and to your life. If this is helping you see more clearly what once felt confusing, this is the kind of content you need to keep consuming. So take a moment now and subscribe to the channel, because the goal here is not just to inspire, but to help you unlock real areas of your life with practical understanding. And this doesn't end here, because in the end, the decision is more direct than you think. Underscore, after all of this, maybe the biggest shift isn't in what you heard, but in what you recognized within yourself. At some point in this video, something specific came to your mind. A decision, a direction, something you've been avoiding. And that wasn't by accident. It reveals something clear. You are not without an answer. You are not lost. You are not waiting for something new. You already know the next step. Now, the question is no longer understanding. It's deciding. In Joshua 20:15 it says, "Choose this day whom you will serve." And that word "today" matters. It doesn't point to the future or the ideal moment. It points to a decision that must move from intention into action, because there comes a point where thinking stops helping and starts becoming avoidance. Maybe you've reached that point. You've analyzed, you've prayed, you've sought confirmation, you've considered every scenario, and still, you remain in the same place. Not because you can't move forward, but because you haven't decided, and that needs to be faced clearly. God is not waiting for you to feel ready. He is waiting for you to respond. To respond with what you have, with the clarity you've already received, even without full control, because that's where transformation happens. And maybe the biggest mistake is thinking you need another sign, when what you need is to trust what's already been shown. If God keeps repeating the same thing, it's not because he hasn't spoken. It's because you haven't responded. And this is not condemnation. It's an invitation to leave paralysis, to leave overthinking, to leave that place where everything seems possible, but nothing happens, and step into movement. Not because everything is clear, but because you chose to move. Now, it's not about what you'll hear next. It's about what you'll do next. Maybe there won't be a big moment, or a perfect feeling, or a new sign, but there is something you already know, and that is enough. So for a moment, be still. Return to what came to your mind. Don't explain it. Don't rationalize it. Just recognize it. And internally, choose not to ignore it anymore. Because in the end, you already know